Hi, my name is John. I created this verse by verse scripture commentary for those who would like to thoughtfully expand their study of the scriptures beyond basic gospel principles. I think this would be particularly helpful for teachers who are looking for ways to more meaningfully engage with their students and with the text. And I'm certainly approaching this from the perspective of having held many teaching callings within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've designed it to move from and beyond the milk based diet, which the Apostle Paul talks about and warns against beyond initial conversion, and into a more meat based diet that requires some more thoughtful chewing, swallowing, and digesting of the Word of God. Welcome, and we are in Genesis chapter 4. We've just concluded with 4 verse 12. Cain has killed his brother Abel. He has been cursed. He's about to be exiled. And now we are going to get his response to the Lord, having heard his punishment for the first time. Chapter 4, verse 13. And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. This word, awan, translated punishment, probably the best interpretation of that. Punishment is probably right. It can also denote guilt. And some people have tried to argue that Cain is remorseful in this moment, that he is so guilty about what he has done. My guilt is more than I can bear. In some, I think even rabbinic traditions, they kind of extrapolate that, and they're saying that the meaning is, how am I ever going to be forgiven of this, right? And they try to make this a little more. I don't even know what to say. The problem with that is the more Cain continues to talk, the more it becomes clear that he's just concerned about how this is going to affect him. He doesn't say anything about Abel. He doesn't say anything about his sin. He doesn't even really confess. He's just concerned about how the punishment affects him. So I would argue, and most scholars do, that Cain's grief here is self-centered. This is what I would refer to as outcome-based regret. It is tied to instrumental morality. What do I mean by that? This is another way of saying that something like behavior is judged as good or bad based on personal payoff. And this is actually quite common. I think this is a pretty human natured thing. But this happens when a person has low empathy. And this is observable in psychology. When empathy is low, regret seems to only appear when the self is harmed. So this would exhibit in different ways. Someone apologizing only after they realize they have to face consequences, or confessing something only after the truth comes out. What Cain did here, obviously murder, is an offense of violence. This becomes kind of it's actually setting the stage for more of what happens in chapter 5, where the world is portrayed as becoming increasingly violent. And it got me thinking about violence in our modern world. And I did some very minimal basic research. But I wonder, like, what percent of violent offenders are repeat offenders violently? And the numbers are about 1 in 3. So if someone commits a violent offense, there's like a 33% chance that once they finish up their consequence, time in prison, whatever it is, they're going to violently offend again. It also reminded me of how you have like historically notorious killers who have used their victims' grave sites as bargaining chips to see what kind of good, sweet deal they could get with the state, or maybe they can get more meals, or maybe they can get better accommodations, right? These are people who or at least have very low empathy. Now, This kind of brings up an interesting conversation because there are some people, uh, some religious people, some Christians, I will say, who genuinely believe, and I've heard this said, that there's just that there's no morality without God. And I've heard this said in various ways, and I'm sure you have too. It's this idea of like, well, I don't understand how an atheist could have good morals because without God, we could just go around killing people with no consequence. Have you heard something like that before? That is someone who lacks empathy. Be very, very skeptical and scared of those people. If you are only doing good to get into heaven, or to avoid going to hell, or to avoid some kind of divine punishment, then you are categorically not a good person. You are only cosplaying as a good person. And remember the metric that the New Testament gives us. Uh, Do not conform to the patterns of this world. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds. That's what true conversion is. It's a true change of mind. It's a true change of heart. And God sees the heart. Remember in 1 Samuel, when he's uh, when he's picking the next king of Israel through Samuel the prophet, and he goes through all of the sons, and nope, that's not the one. That's not the one. Do you have any other sons? Oh, well, we have this little shepherd boy named David, but nobody would ever consider him. And remember, Samuel says the Lord looks, the mankind looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. You cannot hide from him. You can especially not hide from him on your judgment day. This has brought many principles to mind as I'm studying this, and especially as I'm looking at Cain and his attitude towards this whole situation. Checklist religion, in my opinion, rarely produces any Christ-like character because character is internal. It has to do with integrity. It has to do with who you are. I was watching an episode of, or it was like a clip from the Mormon Stories podcast, and John Dehlin, former member of the church, I remember he was attesting to the fact that he still basically follows the word of wisdom. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't use drugs, he doesn't sleep around because he resonates with those principles and he thinks they are good principles outside of any connection to the church. Whereas, compare it to me, and I'll just be very vulnerable with you. I have said, if the church overturned the word of wisdom, I'd go get a cup of coffee tomorrow because I'm a former coffee drinker. And quite frankly, there are times in which I miss it. There are certain commandments that I follow only out of compliance, not out of conviction. And that is the true difference between someone who's being converted and doing things for the right reasons, and someone who is just being compliant and doing things because they're supposed to. Now, of course, you can hope and pray that the Lord softens your heart and changes you over to this thing. I pray that the Lord does the same for me in many of these things. In the case of Cain, it seems that he is only concerned about how this affects him. He is not he doesn't feel really guilty for the crime itself or the people that it damages, unless it has to do with him or his inner circle. Verse 14, behold, so this is Cain's response still, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. I want to look at this phrase, from thy face shall I be hid. Remember, we have talked about, I think just a couple of videos ago, we talked about this Hebrew idiom of the face being lifted or the face being downcast or the face falling. So face up or lifted, if you see that in scripture, it implies divine favor, usually divine. I guess not necessarily. Face down or like countenance fell, that is alienation. Alienation from your community or from your God. This is similar. It's a similar idea, just has slightly different connotations. So if you see, um, there's this phrase you'll find, or it's an idiom, God's face of showing or shining. This implies um, essentially presence, could also be just access to God. So when you see scriptures like "seek His face," or when you that famous doxology that a lot of churches will like close services with, "The Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make His face shine upon you and bring you peace." The reason that that brings you peace is that you are in the presence of God, or that you have access to some kind of divine presence. And then the opposite of that, of course, God's face hidden means a loss of access or a loss of presence. So, in the same way that Cain's punishment is kind of twofold, because he's being exiled physically from the land, he is also being exiled spiritually. He no longer has access, or he's no longer going to be able to access God. And this is slightly different from Adam and Eve. Whereas in the Garden of Eden, they had unlimited access to God. Post Eden, they have limited access to God. They have to perform a ritual or offer a sacrifice, right? We've talked about that. Well, now Cain is going one step further. He's being pushed further east, further away from the presence of God. Now he doesn't even have limited access. He just has no access whatsoever. And he says, well, everyone, probably better translated, whoever, that findeth me shall slay me. And this kind of begs a question: who's gonna slay him? The problem, if you interpret Genesis as a literal historical narrative, is that Cain is basically one of three people on the earth right now, or that Adam and Eve's family unit are the only people on earth. Now, if you were to read the book of Moses into this, perhaps you could say that Adam and Eve had a ton of descendants, right? They've been making children forever and ever, or for a long time. Perhaps Adam is even polygamous. We talked about that in a previous video. And now we've got the equivalent of nations. So maybe there's someone out there among Adam's descendants that would want to kill Cain for having killed Abel. That's possible. My argument, and I think the scholarly opinion, is that this is etiological. That is to say, this is a story that explains why something is the way it is, or how something came about. This is not a population report. There was a joke that I heard a while back that was like, I forget like the punchline of the joke, but basically it was Cain was the only person that killed 25% of the Earth's population in one blow, kind of a thing. It was like this cheeky, yeah. If you believe that this is a population report, then that's true, but it probably is not. And so, what is the ideological narrative here? What is the meaning of this story? This is a way to introduce and explain blood guilt. This is a concept you will find through the Old Testament. It certainly pops up in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. What this is essentially, it's a non-expiring status. Think of it as like a crime in our modern day that does not have a statute of limitations. So shedding innocent blood created a debt that demanded resolution, generally by a member of kin. That would actually kind of go in line with reading the book of Moses into this, because he's worried about Adam's other descendants, perhaps. I've also thought that perhaps Abel has children because we find out in just like a verse or two, Cain has a wife. Why wouldn't Abel have a wife? Maybe he's worried about Abel's children seeking retribution, or perhaps even Adam or Eve themselves. So blood guilt is this status that basically says until the blood is atoned for, until it is justified, until there is justice for that injustice, then this person kind of has a sort of a spiritual bounty on their heads, so to speak. Now, before we get into the next verse, I just want you to think about this. Think about what has transpired. Cain has killed Abel. He felt slighted for one reason or another. He misdirected this anger at God, killed his brother in cold blood, and he has lied to God about it. He's now being sassy about it. He seems to not have any true guilt. He's just worried about how this punishment affects him. And now he's complaining about his punishment. Oh, I'm going to be exiled, and I'm not going to have access to God. And what if somebody out there kills me? So forget what comes next. Forget about the next verse. Imagine you are God. Imagine you are the judge in this situation. How do you respond? Imagine someone kills someone you love, because Abel and God seem to have a very special relationship. This person feels no remorse. Their only concern is, I'm going to be all alone. Let's put it in a modern context. I'm going to be all alone in prison. I might get murdered in prison. What would most people say? Oh, well. So what? Oh, well. So what? Someone, and yep, made your bed and you sleep in it. That's how I think most people's sense of justice would respond. Especially someone who murders an innocent, and someone who maybe betrayed the trust of someone who trusted them in order to kill them. There are some out there who would say, I hope you do. I hope you do get shanked in prison. I hope you do get murdered. Good luck out there. You deserve it, right? Now let's read verse 15. Let's see what God does. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. This is incredible. And this is one of those instances where if you're going to argue that the God of the Old Testament is all wrathful, all vengeance, all anger, all fire, all brimstone, look at special little gems like this. He responds with mercy. He has no reason to do this. He responds with mercy. He places a protective mark on Cain. Yeah, I'll write it in a minute. He places a protective mark on Cain. The Lord he's hurt, he's betrayed, and he still offers preservation to Cain. And again, he really doesn't deserve it. But he does it because the Lord knows it's for the best. In the ancient Near Eastern mind, blood guilt could just create this endless cycle of vengeance, right? So the person who kills Cain, well, now someone's got to avenge Cain's, right? Because this is before the nation state is Israelite law, blood for blood. That's not a concept. So it's sort of like creating this vicious cycle. The person who kills Cain, now you have to kill them, and then you have to kill that person, and then you have to kill that person. And the Lord looks upon Cain, you could say with mercy, maybe even pity. And he says, yeah, I'll just end this cycle of bloodshed before it even starts. And the mark, let me erase this real quick. This word mark, the Lord sets a mark upon Cain. We have seen this word before. You may not know it because it wasn't Mark. We first saw this in Genesis 1:14. He placed the lights in the heavens to govern the day and night, and let them be for signs and seasons, for days and years. It's the same word in Genesis 8-ish. It's something like that. Post-flood. I'm just going to write post-flood. I don't know the reference. When the Lord sets the rainbow in the sky as an ot. of his covenant, of his promise. This is a sign, it's a divine covenantal sign or token. It has deep significance to even what we practice in the temple today, that we receive divine protection and power from the Lord. Now, how is this exactly covenantal, right? The Lord puts a mark on Cain, and he says, whoever kills Cain is going to be, that Cain's blood will be avenged sevenfold. Why is this covenantal? I this is going to be, I'm going to try to skirt around this because this is a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down because I don't like it. This relates to Jewish numerology. I don't like numerology in general because it goes off the rails sometimes before it's even moving. Numerology is a little, I don't know, I hesitate to use the word dumb. I don't like it. I avoid talking about it. I think just people take it too far. There are only 3 numbers that almost all scholars agree were significant for the same symbolic reasons across ancient Near Eastern cultures. The first is, I'll just put it here. The first is the number 4. And this had the connotation of geographic totality of space. So there's 4 directions, like north, east, south, west. You have the 4 corners of the earth. You have I think these are linked. You have the 4 winds that's kind of mentioned in apocalyptic prophecy and literature. It just means the totality of space everywhere. Okay. The second one is the number 7. The number 7 indicated ritual. I think you could say it's ritual completion and order. So think of days of creation, where God divinely ordered the universe, and He completed everything in that span of time. Or more specifically, on the 7th day, He rested. Remember, we talked about that. Rest not meaning He's fatigued, rest meaning He's put down His tools and the work is finished. That this is almost a declaration of, I'm done with the work. And it was because of that connotation, it was associated with kind of a godly number. So sometimes you will see this in even Christian numerology where they'll say 7 is the number of God. And maybe that's why 666 is the evil number, because it's like it falls short of right before 7. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm already getting. And then the number 10, which was essentially totality. It's a completion, kind of like the number 7, except this had a concept of like the full measure of something, right? So when God is punishing Egypt, how many plagues does He send to show the full measure of His divine punishment? 10 plagues. How many commandments does He give to His covenant people? 10 commandments. What percent of your resources do you have to pledge to the temple in order to keep the covenantal temple work going? 10%, a tenth tithe. It's the full measure of what is owed or what is due. So that is, these are the 3. Now in, I shouldn't have said Jewish. I've already messed it up, guys. I should have said ancient Near Eastern numerology, because there are some numbers that pop up in Jewish tradition. I'll just call it Jewish numerology. Basically, these are recurring numbers that maybe not every culture around the Israelites or the Jewish people had the concept of what these meant, but in the Bible, they kind of seem to hold significance. So the first is 12. This has covenant implications, usually, or like chosen. right? So 12 tribes of Israel. Later in the New Testament, Jesus appoints 12 apostles. Okay. 40, which indicated a generation. Usually one generation is 40 years. 70, which actually will pop up sooner than you think here because we're going to get to the table of nations in a few videos. 70 just meant nations or perhaps the world, because in the table of nations in the Bible, it's divided into 70 groups, basically 70 nations, and that represented in their mind the totality of the world. So when Jesus says to his apostles, "Hey, I'm going to appoint a bunch of people to help you spread the gospel," how many does he appoint? 70. And in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, those who report directly to the 12, the quorum of the 12, it's the 70s. Of course, we have multiple quorums of the 70s because the world is a lot bigger than just 70 nations, but it's a symbolic number. The last one is 1,000. Pops up here and there. 1,000 meaning generally like magnitude, more than I can even count. That was sort of the idea. That verse, a 1,000 years is a day, right? Or when we think about the millennium, 1,000-year reign of perfection, right? It's this idea. It's just this magnificent magnitude kind of a thing. All right. So what is this? Why even go into all of this? For Cain's vengeance to be sevenfold, what that essentially implies is that if someone kills Cain, they are going to face divine justice. In other words, God is saying, okay, you're worried about someone hurting you. I'm going to put a sign on you. Anyone who hurts you, I will handle them personally. That's kind of the implication. The mark shows that Cain is under God's protection, even outside of God's presence. One way that I like to conceptualize the mark or the sign that is put on Cain, this protective mark, is kind of what I do day in and day out. So I work for local government. I occasionally have to go into really rough, sketchy parts of the city, but I always have on me, and I have to have on me, displayed my government ID, my badge, and that makes me feel a lot better about some of these places I'm going. Now, it's not going to prevent someone from necessarily pulling a gun on me or from hurting me in any way, but it does de-incentivize, because if you hurt a local government employee, you are not going to fare well before the judge. And so that's kind of what's happening here. It's not saying that Cain is immortal. It's not saying that someone isn't going to kill Cain, but the person who kills Cain is going to have to answer before the divine judge, and it is not going to fare well for them. I want to talk about the mark of Cain as it pertains to some of the early Latter-day Saint interpretation, because I think it's important. It was talked about enough that it warrants a discussion. In the ancient world, and all the way up to like the 16th century CE, AD, there were several ways which people categorized other people. The first was language. Another was culture. Another was religion. Another was place of origin. And another was political affiliation, political allegiance. That is how human beings have been broadly categorized for most of human history until the 16th to 18th centuries, when you had European colonization, and notably the transatlantic slave trade. Now, are there exceptions to this? I'm sure. I'm sure somebody can pull up an obscure exception where maybe at some point in history there was categorization based on ethnicity, based on skin color, that sort of thing. But I'm just speaking broadly. I'm not a sociologist. I'm just trying to contextualize what became a very popular biblical interpretation. And so, as a way for European thinkers to essentially justify slavery and colonial rule and dispossession and displacement of people, these folks began trying to sort humans into races. Now, races, I mean, you hear race now, we're just so steeped in it, we kind of know what this means. There's an ethnic connotation, perhaps even a skin color connotation. Um, back in the day, race just, it really meant like, it was kind of used for animals. It was like stock or a breed, perhaps lineage. So if you were uh, linking your lineage to a royal family, you could say, "Oh, I have, royal blood. I come from a race of nobles." Right. The reason that the European thinkers and the colonizers needed to resort the way they understood the categories of people, and why they kind of invented is, I don't know if that's the right word, but why the category of race started coming up is that it needed to be fixed. It needed to identify visible, stable markers across generations that could be linked to deeper traits, namely this idea of inferiority versus superiority. There are some people who are born to rule, and there are some people who are born to be ruled. See, the problem with all of this is it's not fixed. With language, you can adopt a different language. It's adoptable. Culture is learnable. Religion is convertible. Place of origin, I mean, you can just move and say you're from somewhere else. Um, I say I'm from the East Coast. That's true. I lived there for a long time. Wasn't born there. It's flexible. Political allegiance is changeable, especially changeable when the tides kind of ebb and flow, the political tides. So this wasn't going to work to justify slavery, to justify colonization. So they needed to create something different, and that was namely based on skin color. And then by the 18th to 19th century, I'll move up here, centuries, in American Protestantism, specifically the theology, it became widespread, this idea of interpreting Cain's mark as black skin and the curse of Ham, we will read about later, as being of African descent. This was so widespread that early Mormons just assumed it. And this starts to pop up in Latter-day Saint literature. The Book of Moses specifically says that blackness came upon the descendants of Canaan. You have the infamous 2 Nephi, chapter 5, that talks about the skin of blackness as a curse upon the wicked Lamanites, and there's specific warnings about race mixing. Curseth is the man that mixeth with his seed, or something like that. What is important, I think, from a historical context is to recognize that the Book of Mormon, or at least the way that the Book of Mormon was interpreted, stems from the idea of the mound builders. If you've ever heard this. It's the mound builder myth. This was a very common idea in Joseph Smith's era. And what it essentially did, it's a very racist idea, but the idea is that look at all those great structures in ancient America. Surely the Native Americans couldn't have built that because they're savages. That was the idea. They had to pave the way for this narrative about somehow this other race of people, whether they came from Europe or Asia, or there were some myths that said even from Atlantis, they came over to the American continent and they were the ones that built these structures. And then, through no fault of their own, they were either destroyed or just mysteriously vanished. And the Book of Mormon in this context reads as essentially this civilized, white, and delightsome people. They are destroyed by a dark, loathsome, degraded people. And that people, they're the ones that survive as kind of the remnant group. Now, don't get me wrong. There are ways to read the Book of Mormon without this, but this is absolutely how it was interpreted in the 19th century. And I will go as far as to even just start pointing out to the early Native American missions. They called them the Lamanite missions because it was taught that the Native Americans were the Lamanites, that they were, or the descendants of the Lamanites. Our church doesn't even teach that anymore. They've adjusted that phrasing. Is it in the title? It's not on the title page, but it's one of the introductions of the Book of Mormon. That now they say, well, the Native Americans are among the ancestors of the Lamanites. They accept that there were a lot more people groups on the American continent that were building stuff, and they had civilization and things like that. I'm going to read a quote to you here from Joseph Smith, because I hear when this race dialogue gets brought up, I think people start to feel defensive. And what I hear a lot is like, well, that was kind of a later perversion, perhaps. Like maybe Brigham Young took that and ran with it. But Joseph Smith wasn't racist. He ordained a black member to the priesthood, and he was going to free the slaves. And okay, I'd encourage you to look into the context of some of that as a side note. But I just want to read this quote from Joseph Smith. He says, quote, "Had I anything to do with the Negro, I would confine them by strict law to their own species and put them on a national equalization." And that is found in the History of the Church, Volume 5, 217 to 218. I believe that's pages 217 to 218. In other words, Joseph Smith believed in separate but equal. That is the political ideology that gave way to segregation. So in that way, I suppose Joseph Smith was 40, 50 years ahead of his time, but inherently a racist idea. If there is any question about how early prophets interpreted the mark of Cain, here's a quote from Brigham Young, 1852. Remember, we're still talking Brigham Young, president of the church, prophet of God. This can be found in Journal of Discourses 7, page 290. He says, quote, "What is the mark? You will see it on the countenance of every African you ever did see, the mark of Cain," end quote. Brigham Young has a lot of comments and a lot of teachings on the mark of Cain. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I can't read them. I don't want to read them because I fear that the spirit that I'm trying to nurture here on this channel, or at least in this particular video, is going to deflate pretty quickly. Brigham Young's attitudes toward folks of African descent, toward people of color, absolutely disgust me. They are abhorrent. They are offensive. There's just no other way to say it. And I won't be able to stay kind-spirited toward him if I read some of his comments. But my point is that these beliefs, they evolved into church doctrine and church culture. You started to get these ideas of premortal neutrality or lack of valiance. So the reason that people were born with dark skin is that somehow they didn't fight as hard in the Lord's army in the premortal war. That was taught. If a person of color was righteous enough, it was taught that they could become white. They used to tell little boys and little girls of color, if you pray hard enough, if you're righteous enough, if you follow the commandments, your skin can become white. And I'm not talking 200 years ago. I'm talking like recently, like within, I mean, there are people still alive today that this was being taught to people while they were alive. The church also warned against race mixing, mixing marriages, basically, or race mixing in marriages. Don't marry somebody who is of a different skin color than you. And sometimes this was conflated with like a law of chastity thing or like a sin thing. So yeah, this was not long ago. Even in 1967, Ezra Taft Benson, who the BYU plant sciences and biology building is named after, he says, quote, "The arm of flesh may not approve nor understand why God has not bestowed the priesthood on women or the seed of Cain, but God's ways are not man's ways," end quote. That was in General Conference, October of 1967. Now, of course, in 1978, ban is lifted. The priesthood ban on black members, lifted. But this idea of the mark of Cain or the curse of Cain being black skin, or that black skin was part of that mark or part of that curse, it wasn't disavowed in 1978. You want to guess when it was disavowed? Do you have any guesses?
I mean, I think like 2000, really recently.
Very recent, 2013.
Yeah.
I started studying with the missionaries in 2013, which means there may have actually been some overlap. Do I have a date on that? Yes, December 6th, 2013. I started studying with the missionaries around April or May of 2013. So I was loosely part of this church. I was mingling with the church and learning about the church during a time when it still would have been acceptable, not prohibited officially, to teach that the mark of Cain was a curse of black skin. And my whole point in this is not to demonize anybody. I mean, I certainly feel a certain way about it. I think you should feel a certain way about it because it's wrong. It started with evil things. But the whole point is, there is danger in reading your culture into the text. This needs to have proper exegetical extrapolation. You need to know who it was written to, who wrote it, who it was written to, why it was written, and how it would have been interpreted. You cannot read modern understandings of things into an ancient text any farther than you're just trying to relate to it. You certainly not to create doctrine or dogma. And I wonder, I have to ask, what if we had seen the mark of Cain as what it was? As an act of mercy, as an act of preservation. What if the church had always taught that, rather than it was part of a curse? The idea that God has sovereignty over and preserves people who even leave his presence, who no longer have access to him. What a beautiful idea. How would we treat former members of the church a little differently, knowing that principle? How would we treat our loved ones who have since departed from us, knowing that God may still protect and defend them? I think it's a really important principle, and it's something that we shouldn't take for granted, because this crap and this doctrine hurt real people and still has negative effects that linger to this day. May we all learn how to properly extract the meaning of the text, to understand it, rather than to just read it with our limited filters over top of it. I think that concludes this video. We'll just pick up right after here in verse 16, where Cain now is out in exile and what that leads to in the coming chapters. I will leave these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ.